Beneath an abandoned bridge, a 6-year-old girl heard the threatening roar of approaching motorcycles. Hidden between the concrete pillars, she saw the millionaire who always helped her being cornered by a furious gang. "You rich people are the cause of all our problems," the bikers shouted as they dragged him toward the edge of the bridge. Desperate, the girl screamed, "Let him go or you'll regret it." Everyone laughed at the threat of a child until she grabbed a rusty iron pipe, and what she did left everyone in shock. Arthur Sterling felt the weight of the day on his shoulders, but it wasn't the kind of tired that a night's sleep could cure. It was an exhaustion of the soul, a void that not even his immense fortune could fill. From the leather seat of his imported car, he watched the slow-moving traffic on the bridge, a river of lights indifferent to the world hidden beneath it. This was his secret ritual, an escape from the sterility of his mansion and the board meetings where they discussed figures and profits that seemed increasingly abstract. Down below, in the cold, damp and constant gloom, there was something real. There was Leah. He cut the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the city's incessant hum. The smell of pollution and the stagnant river invaded the cabin as he opened the door, but Arthur no longer cared. He walked down the concrete ramp, the sound of his expensive leather shoes echoing like a profanity in this sanctuary of the forgotten. Leah, huddled in her nest of cardboard and old fabrics, heard the footsteps and her small heart sped up, but not with fear. It was the sound of hope. For as long as she could remember, this man was the only constant in her life of uncertainty. He didn't say much, but his eyes conveyed a kindness that was warmer than any blanket. He always brought a paper bag with a warm roll, a juice box, and sometimes a chocolate bar. To her, it was a feast. He was her angel in a suit, a beacon of goodness in an ocean of indifference. She peeked through a slit in her hideout. There he was, his graying hair perfectly combed, his face etched with worries she couldn't comprehend. He looked around, searching for her. "Leah." His voice was a low whisper, almost lost in the noise of the cars overhead. She emerged from the shadows, a shy smile blooming on her dirty face. He smiled back, handing her the bag. Their fingers touched for an instant, the contrast between his soft, well-cared-for skin and hers, rough and cold. A silent summary of their two worlds. As she unwrapped the bread with a sacred reverence, a different sound cut through the air. It wasn't the familiar hum of cars. It was a deep, growing growl that seemed to make the concrete itself vibrate. Arthur tensed, turning instinctively toward the entrance of the ramp. Leah, who knew every noise in this place, felt a chill run down her spine. This was the sound of danger. The roar became deafening, and suddenly, 6 powerful motorcycles descended the ramp, their headlights tearing through the darkness and blinding Arthur. They stopped abruptly, forming a menacing semicircle around him. The engines were cut one by one, and the ensuing silence was more terrifying than the noise. Leah, paralyzed by fear, hid again in her refuge, the bread forgotten in her lap. She could see everything through a small hole in the cardboard. The men dismounted, tall and imposing in their leather jackets. Their faces were obscured by dark helmets, making them nameless figures, anonymous predators. The man who seemed to be the leader walked slowly toward Arthur, who remained motionless, his expression a mix of confusion and a naive lack of fear. He didn't understand. He saw only men, not the storm of fury they brought with them. The leader stopped inches from Arthur, the helmet's dark visor reflecting the distorted image of the billionaire. From her hideout, Leah's heart beat so hard she feared they could hear it. She saw the leader's hand rise, not to greet, but to point an accusing finger directly at Arthur's chest. The voice, muffled by the helmet, was a growl of metal and fury. "Arthur Sterling," the man said, and the name, spoken with such contempt, sounded alien in this damp, forgotten place. "The great billionaire, the wizard of investments, the oracle of the exchange. Did you think no one would know who you are?" Arthur blinked, surprise overpowering his initial fear. How did they know his name? His mind, accustomed to solving complex business problems and calculating the cash flow of his companies, tried to find a logic for the situation. Perhaps it was a poorly planned mugging. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, his voice calm and controlled. "Gentlemen, if this is about money, we can work this out. I don't have much on me, but I can arrange for whatever you need." He thought the offer of his vast wealth would solve any problem. The response was a collective laugh, a harsh, mirthless sound that ricocheted off the concrete pillars. The leader stepped forward, invading Arthur's personal space. "Money!" He spat the word. "You think everything can be solved with your money? The same money that took the food off our tables." Leah, huddled, held her breath. Her small hands clutched the frayed fabric of her clothes. She didn't understand the words about investments and business, but she understood the hatred in that man's voice perfectly. That hatred was aimed at her angel, and it terrified her. She saw Arthur take a step back, the confusion on his face giving way to a growing apprehension. He was no longer in control. The leader continued his speech, his voice rising with each word. "While you hoard your fortune, buying more stocks, investing in gold and crypto, people like us lose our jobs, our families fall apart, the entire city suffers because of decisions made in luxurious boardrooms by men like you." The accusation hung in the air, thick and heavy. Arthur tried to argue, to talk about the economy, about the need for restructuring for companies to survive, but his words were lost, swallowed by the group's palpable anger. He was used to being heard, to having his opinion respected. Here, under the bridge, his wealth and status were worthless. On the contrary, they were the reason for his condemnation. "We don't want your assets, Sterling. We don't want your stocks or your bonds," the leader declared, his voice cold. "We want justice, a lesson. We want you to feel, just for a moment, what it's like to have no ground beneath you, what it's like to be thrown out like trash." The meaning of those words took a second to settle in Arthur's mind. He glanced at the edge of the concrete structure and beyond it at the darkness of the river. Fear, cold and sharp, finally hit him with full force. This wasn't a robbery. It was something far worse. It was personal. Leah saw two of the other men move, one on each side of Arthur. They grabbed his arms with brutal force. Arthur's cry of surprise was muffled by one of their gloved hands. He struggled, but his strength, softened by a life of comfort, was useless against the hardened fury of these men. The bag of food he had brought for Leah fell to the ground, the juice box rolling near the girl's hiding place, a pathetic reminder of a kind gesture that had turned into a nightmare. They began to drag him. Arthur's expensive shoes, which had walked on the most luxurious carpets in the world, now scraped against the cement floor in a sharp sound of surrender. Leah squeezed her eyes shut but couldn't look away. They were taking him to the edge, to the darkness that swallowed everything. The men's fingers were like steel claws on his arms. Arthur felt the expensive wool of his suit jacket stretch and tear, a trivial sound that somehow made the nightmare even more real. Each forced step toward the edge of the bridge was a step out of his orderly universe, a universe where capital was king and problems were solved with phone calls and wire transfers. He tried to plant his feet, to use his body weight, but it was useless. Their strength came from a place of desperation and anger that his life of comfort had never taught him to fight. The cold night air whipped his face, mixed with the rancid smell of the river below. The fear, once a cold wave, was now an ocean drowning him. His mind, a sharp instrument for negotiations and investment strategies, was blank. He could think of nothing but the darkness below the bridge and the fall that awaited him. The irony was crushing. All his wealth, his multi-billion-dollar net worth, couldn't buy him another second of life at that moment. From her hiding spot, Leah watched with terror-widened eyes. The tears she had held back so tightly began to stream down, tracing clean paths on her dusty face. That man, her only friend, was being hurt. The sound of his struggle, the muffled grunts, were like knives in her chest. Helplessness paralyzed her. She was small, weak, invisible. What could she do against these leather-clad giants? Her instinct screamed at her to stay quiet, to shrink further into the shadows and wait for them to leave. Survival was about that, being small, being silent. But then she saw Arthur's face for an instant, illuminated by the headlights of a passing car above. She saw the pure terror in his eyes, the same expression she saw in the broken mirror she kept as a treasure on the coldest, loneliest nights. In that moment, he wasn't a billionaire. He was just someone scared, needing help, and she was the only one there to see it. Get a taste of the fall. "Sterling!" shouted one of the men, his voice full of a bitter triumph. "Feel what it's like to lose everything in an instant." They shoved him against the cold, rusted guardrail. The freezing metal pressed against his back, the abyss calling to him. He could feel the vibration of the bridge, the world continuing its normal course above while his was about to end. The leader approached, taking off his helmet to reveal a tired face, marked by years of hard work and disappointment. "This isn't for us," he said, his voice lower now, but heavy with a deep pain. "It's for our families, for our kids who don't understand why there's no more food on the table. It's so men like you learn that your decisions have real consequences." Arthur looked into the man's eyes and, for the first time, didn't see a criminal, but a distorted reflection of himself. A man trying to protect what he loved. But it was too late for understanding. The men began to lift him, his feet leaving the solid ground. Total panic seized Arthur. The scream he wanted to let out was trapped in his throat. The image of her angel being lifted over the railing was what broke fear's spell on Leah. A primal fire, a protective fury she didn't know she possessed, exploded inside her small chest. No, she couldn't let them hurt the only good person she knew. Her eyes darted around her domain of debris, searching for anything, a rock, a piece of wood, and then she saw it. Leaning against one of the pillars, forgotten and covered in dust, was a rusty iron pipe, about 3 feet long. It was heavy, dirty, a useless relic from the world above, but to Leah in that instant, it was a sword. It was the only weapon she had. Time seemed to slow as the bikers adjusted their grip for the final push. Leah knew she had only a second. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but determination was stronger. Her small, trembling hands closed around the pipe's cold metal. A sharp, almost feral cry tore through the air. "Let him go!" The voice was thin, childlike, but filled with a ferocity that made everyone freeze for a moment. The bikers turned, surprised, looking for the source of the challenge. The sight they saw was so absurd that for a second they thought it was a hallucination. From the gloom emerged a tiny figure, a dirty, tangled-haired girl, dragging an iron pipe that was almost as tall as she was. Her eyes, large and dark, burned with a fury that contradicted her fragility. "I said let him go," she repeated, her voice trembling but firm. "Or you'll be sorry." For a second, a shocked silence fell over the place. Arthur, suspended in the air, turned his head just enough to see Leah. An even greater wave of despair washed over him. No, not her. Anything but getting her involved. He would rather fall. The biker's surprise quickly turned to amusement. The tension broke in a loud, mocking laugh. "Well, look what we have here," one of them said, approaching Leah with slow, threatening steps. "The billionaire's little defender. What are you going to do with that little girl? Tickle us." He reached out to grab the pipe, but Leah stepped back, raising her improvised weapon with visible effort. "Stay back," she snarled. The scene was both pathetic and heroic. The child against the giants. Arthur struggled with renewed strength, trying to draw attention away from Leah, to scream for her to run, but the hand over his mouth smothered his warnings. He could only watch, helpless, as the danger turned toward the only person trying to save him. The leader, who had been watching the scene with an unreadable expression, signaled for the other man to stop. He walked over to Leah, crouching down to her level, which somehow made him even more intimidating. "You're brave, kid," he said, his voice devoid of the others' mockery. "But this isn't your fight. This man isn't who you think he is. He's part of the problem. Go home." "He's my friend," Leah yelled, tears of fear and anger finally overflowing. "He's the only good person. You're the bad ones." Her simple, direct words hit the leader in a way Arthur's arguments couldn't. For an instant, a shadow of doubt crossed his face. But it was only an instant. The reality of his struggles, the image of his own children, hardened his resolve again. "His kindness is a handout," he said, standing up. "A way to clear his conscience. It's easy to give away a loaf of bread when you own the whole bakery." He turned to his men. "Let's finish this." The command broke the spell. The men holding Arthur prepared for the final shove. Leah's time was up. Desperation gave her a sudden clarity. She couldn't fight them, not head-on. But maybe she didn't have to. Her gaze swept over the parked motorcycles, their engines still warm. She remembered seeing smoke coming from a silver metal tube on one of them, a tube at the back. A crazy plan, born of pure survival instinct, formed in her mind. It was a one-in-a-million shot, but it was the only one she had. As the men adjusted Arthur's body over the railing, preparing for the final act, Leah moved. With all the strength her small body could muster, she ran, not toward them, but toward the nearest motorcycle, the leaders. Ignoring their surprised shouts, she lifted the heavy iron pipe. Her muscles protested, but adrenaline was a powerful fuel. With a grunt of effort, she shoved the end of the rusty pipe directly into the motorcycle's shiny chrome exhaust. Metal met metal with a dull, grotesque sound. For a second, nothing happened. The bikers, caught off guard by the girl's bizarre action, just stared at her, dumbfounded. The leader steps away from pushing Arthur into the abyss, spun around, his eyes widening under the helmet's shadow. "What did you do?" he roared, his voice echoing with renewed fury. It was then that the engine's residual heat met the sudden blockage. The internal pressure, with nowhere to escape, built up in a fraction of a second. The result was a dry, violent explosion. A deafening bang, much louder than a gunshot, reverberated under the bridge, making the ground shake. A fireball of flame and black smoke shot backward, throwing Leah, who was still holding the pipe, several feet. She hit the cement floor hard, the air knocked out of her lungs, her head hitting with a dull thud. The chaos was instantaneous. The explosion, amplified by the underpass acoustics, sounded like a bomb to anyone on the surface. Tires screeched on the asphalt above. The unwanted attention the bikers had so carefully avoided was now fully on them. In the distance, a siren began to wail, a sharp, rising sound that promised the imminent arrival of the law. Panic seized the group. The plan for social justice had turned into a loud, dangerous mess. At the moment of the explosion, the two men holding Arthur instinctively loosened their grip, turning toward the source of the noise. It was the only chance Arthur needed. Fueled by adrenaline and the survival instinct, he fought back with the strength of a desperate man. He twisted his body, kicked backward, and managed to break free. Without hesitation, he ran, not for the exit ramp, but in the opposite direction, diving deeper into the darkness under the bridge, where the shadows and debris offered a chance to hide. His first victory was freedom, but the cost was immediate and terrible. As he fled, he left Leah behind. The girl was lying on the ground, motionless, near the damaged motorcycle. The bikers, furious and with the police approaching, momentarily forgot about Arthur. Their humiliation was complete. They had been defeated and exposed by a street kid. Their anger, once focused on the symbol of inequality Arthur represented, now had a new, small, and vulnerable target. The leader strode over to Leah, his face a mask of rage. He nudged her with his boot. "Get up," he ordered. Leah moaned, trying to move, but the pain in her head was a thick fog, preventing her from thinking clearly. The siren was getting closer. "We gotta go," yelled one of the others, already on his bike. "Forget the kid." But the leader couldn't. The image of that girl defying them, the explosion, the humiliation, it was too much to ignore. "She cost us everything," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "She's not getting away with it." Hidden behind a concrete pillar, Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He watched the scene unfold, the relief of his escape quickly replaced by a paralyzing horror. He was safe, but Leah was in mortal danger because of him. He had put her in this situation with his naive kindness, with his presence in a place that was not his. The internal conflict tore him in two. Run and save himself, or go back and face 6 furious men to protect a child he barely knew. The siren became deafening, and red and blue lights began to flash at the ramp's entrance. The time for decisions was over. The leader glanced at the entrance, then at Leah, and made a quick, brutal decision. Instead of fleeing, he bent down, grabbed the girl's fragile arm, and yanked her to her feet. Her cry of pain was a dagger in Arthur's heart. The man dragged her toward his own bike, the one that wasn't damaged. The message was clear. If they couldn't have the billionaire, they would take his little guardian angel. The police cruiser's lights swept through the darkness under the bridge, painting the chaotic scene in flashes of blue and red. The sight of armed officers at the ramp's entrance was the final trigger. Panic overcame vengeance. "Leave her, Marcus! Let's go!" one of the bikers shouted, starting his engine. Marcus, the leader, hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hand still gripping Leah's arm. The girl's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror and pain. Looking at her was like looking into the abyss of his own failure. He let her go with a shove that made her stumble and fall again. "You got lucky, kid," he spat the words, more to himself than to her. In seconds, the engines roared in unison, the motorcycles turned with impressive skill, speeding up a beaten dirt path on the other side of the bridge, an escape route the police in their car could never follow. In an instant, they were gone, leaving behind only the smell of smoke, the echo of their engines, and a terrified girl on the ground. Arthur emerged from his hiding place. His heart still racing, he ran to Leah, kneeling beside her. "Leah, are you okay? Talk to me." She was trembling, a trickle of blood running from where her head had hit. Her eyes met his, full of confusion and fear. He helped her sit up, the relief of finding her alive so overwhelming that his legs felt weak. The police officers came down the ramp, guns drawn, finding a bizarre scene. A man in a torn, dirty suit with a scratched face, holding a small street child next to a smoldering motorcycle. The questions started, rapid and impersonal. Who were they? What did they want? Why was he here? Arthur, his mind still spinning, tried to explain, but the words came out broken. How could he explain his relationship with Leah without it sounding strange, suspicious? How could he justify his presence in that place? He immediately realized the first major obstacle. He couldn't just say, "She's my friend." Society had rules, laws, and an inherent suspicion of situations like this. A rich man and a street girl. The implications were ugly. He invented a quick story. He had been the victim of an attempted robbery, and the girl who was nearby had gotten scared and hurt in the confusion. It was a half-truth, but it omitted the most crucial part. The officers, though skeptical, took his statement. An ambulance was called for Leah. As the paramedics examined her, Arthur felt a new kind of fear. They would take her to a hospital and then to a government shelter. He would lose sight of her, hand her over to an impersonal, bureaucratic system he knew was flawed. He couldn't let that happen, not after what she had done for him. In the days that followed, Arthur's life was turned upside down. He used his influence and a team of expensive lawyers to follow Leah's case. He managed to ensure she received the best medical care and, out for the time being, kept her from being sent to a shelter, arguing that the trauma required a more stable environment, which he was willing to pay for. But this raised more questions, more suspicion. Why such an interest? Meanwhile, the second obstacle materialized in a terrifying way. On the second night after the incident, his mansion's security camera recorded a lone motorcycle passing slowly in front of his gate. No direct threat, just a presence, a silent message. They knew where he lived. The sanctuary of his home, with its high walls and private security, suddenly felt fragile. The threat hadn't disappeared. It had just changed shape, becoming more subtle and sinister. They didn't just want his money or his life. They wanted to destroy his peace. And they had a new weapon to use against him. His concern for Leah. 3 days passed, but for Arthur, they felt like 3 weeks of contained agony. He sat in his office atop a skyscraper, a king in a glass castle, watching the city stretch out below like a map of his own dealings. Monitors displayed stock market charts, the profitability of his funds, the cash flow of his companies. He could move millions of dollars with a single phone call, influence the market, build or dismantle empires. Yet all this wealth, all this power seemed like a cruel joke. He couldn't guarantee the safety of a single child. Leah was in a temporary foster home, a clean, safe institution his lawyers had found and which he funded generously. But it was a gilded cage. He received daily reports. She was quiet, not eating well, barely speaking to the other children. The trauma had silenced her. Guilt gnawed at Arthur. He was the cause of all of it. His presence in her life had painted a target on her back. The helplessness was a poison. He was used to solving problems, to taking the initiative. Waiting for bureaucracy and the police to act was torture. The image of the motorcycle passing his house haunted his nights. It was a cold war, a battle of nerves, and he felt he was losing. That afternoon, he couldn't take it anymore. He needed to see her, to be sure with his own eyes that she was okay. Disobeying the advice of his lawyers and security detail, he arranged a discreet meeting in a small public park near the foster home. It would be quick, just a few minutes. He brought a teddy bear, a gesture that felt both essential and absurdly inadequate. He found her sitting on a bench with a social worker. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, a faint glimmer of her old hope. That glimmer was enough to reaffirm his determination. He sat beside her, handing her the bear. She hugged it tightly, burying her face in the soft fur. For a moment, in that small oasis of normalcy, Arthur felt he might be able to fix things. That's when he heard it, the sound that had become the soundtrack to his nightmares, the low, menacing growl of a motorcycle engine, not 6, just 2. They appeared on the street adjacent to the park, moving slowly, like sharks circling their prey. Arthur's blood ran cold. The social worker looked up, confused. But he knew. Leah knew, too. Her body tensed against him, the teddy bear falling to the ground. One of the bikes stopped. The rider was Marcus. He lifted his helmet's visor, and his eyes met Arthur's over the park's low fence. There was no anger on his face, only a cold, determined calm. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His gaze said it all. We know where to find her. There is nowhere you can hide her. Panic seized Leah. She let out a small cry and started to run, not toward the street, but deep into the park, toward a maze of playground equipment. "Leah, wait!" Arthur yelled, running after her, his heart hammering in his chest. The second bike sped up, circling the park to cut off their escape route on the other side. It wasn't an attack, it was a hunt. They were terrorizing her, showing Arthur how vulnerable she was, how powerless he was to protect her. He caught up to her near a slide, pulling her behind him as Marcus dismounted, walking slowly toward the park entrance. He was in no hurry. The game was his. Arthur's world shrank to that small space behind the slide. He could feel the trembling of Leah's body against his. each muffled sob an indictment of his failure to protect her. Marcus moved with a predatory calm, unhurried, savoring the terror his mere presence caused. He stopped a few feet from the park entrance, hands in the pockets of his leather jacket, as if he were a father watching his kids play. The normality of the gesture was what made it so terrifying. "You see, Sterling?" Marcus's voice was low, but it cut through the afternoon air like broken glass. "There are no walls high enough, no bank account big enough. Wherever you put her, we will find her." Arthur gently pushed Leah further behind him, creating a barrier with his own body. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice hoarse with tension. "I'll give you whatever you want. Money, a job, company stock. Just name a price and leave her alone." Marcus let out a short, bitter laugh. "Price? You still think in terms of transactions, of capital. You don't get it, do you? Some debts can't be paid with your dirty money." He took a step into the park, the sound of his boots on the gravel like a countdown. The social worker, finally realizing this was more than a chance encounter, started to get up from the bench, cell phone in hand, but the look Marcus shot her way made her freeze. "This is between him and me," Marcus said, his eyes never leaving Arthur. "It's a business discussion about the liabilities your business created in other people's lives." The mention of the word business sounded like an insult. Arthur felt a wave of impotent fury. His whole life was built around his ability to negotiate, to find solutions, to turn losses into profits. But here, before this man, all his skills were useless. He had nothing to offer because what Marcus wanted wasn't material. It was vengeance. It was the obliteration of his peace. "She has nothing to do with this," Arthur insisted, his voice pleading. "She's just a child. She has everything to do with it now," Marcus countered, his voice like ice. "And you made her important. You pulled her out of the invisibility where she was safe and put her in the spotlight of your world. You made her your most precious asset, and people like you always lose what's most precious." Every word was a calculated blow, designed to maximize Arthur's guilt and fear. It was working. Arthur felt the weight of his responsibility crushing him. Marcus was right. His intervention, born of pure compassion, had put Leah in a danger she never would have faced in her life of quiet misery. The silence was broken by the sound of the other motorcycle starting up. It was a signal. The time for intimidation was over. Marcus looked at Leah, huddled behind Arthur, and for the first time, an expression that wasn't hatred crossed his face. It was something more complex, almost like pity. "Take care of her, Sterling," he said, and the tone was a veiled threat. "Enjoy it while you can." He turned and walked back to his bike without hurry. He mounted, put on his helmet, and with one last look, sped off, disappearing down the street with his accomplice. The silence they left behind was heavy, filled with unspoken terror. The social worker rushed over, stammering questions, but Arthur barely heard her. He knelt in front of Leah, holding her face in his hands. "It's over, honey. They're gone. You're safe." But she wasn't safe. He knew it. The park, the foster home, the entire city. Nothing was safe. As the social worker talked frantically on the phone with her superiors, a cold clarity washed over Arthur. The system couldn't protect her. The rules didn't apply. He had to get her off this chessboard. He had to do something drastic, something his lawyers would call insane. He took out his own phone, ignoring the woman's protests. He dialed the number of his head of security, an ex-military man who operated in a legal grey area. "Prep the jet," Arthur said, his voice firm and unshakable, "and get a team ready. We're going to get a child." Arthur's decision unleashed a bureaucratic and legal firestorm. His lawyers called him reckless. The director of the foster home accused him of undue interference. The police, already suspicious, intensified their investigation into him, openly questioning his motives. To them, a billionaire trying to take a street kid out of the country without due process smelled of scandal. or worse. The sterling name, once synonymous with success and discreet philanthropy, began appearing in gossip columns and local news, always accompanied by innuendo and leading questions. Tycoon obsessed with street child, one headline read, "Why is a man so rich involved with the homeless?" The social pressure became a new battlefront. Other city moguls, fearing the incident under the bridge might inspire similar retaliation against them, began to distance themselves from Arthur. At board meetings and cocktail parties, he was met with cold stares and whispers. They didn't see him as a victim, but as someone who had poked the bear, bringing the danger of the underworld into their privileged circle. Instead of solidarity, they called for more private security, more walls, more isolation, deepening the social chasm that had created the conflict in the first place. While Arthur's reputation was being publicly attacked, he was waging a silent war behind the scenes. He dug deep into his personal funds, using his vast wealth to hire the best private investigators money could buy. He needed to know who Marcus was, not the gang leader, but the man behind the helmet. What drove him? What was his story? The answer came a week later, in an encrypted digital file that arrived on his tablet in the middle of the night. The information hit him like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of him. Marcus Thorne, former shift supervisor at Sterling Manufacturing, one of the first companies Arthur had inherited and drastically restructured years ago to ensure its profitability and increase shareholder dividends. The restructuring, praised at the time as a masterstroke of business, had resulted in the termination of over 200 employees. Marcus was on that list. Suddenly, it all made sense. The personal anger, the accusations about decisions made in boardrooms, the mention of families torn apart. This wasn't a random attack on a symbol of wealth. It was a deferred vengeance, brewed over years of resentment. Arthur felt sick. He vaguely remembered that time, the spreadsheets, the profit projections. The cold logic that dictated those cuts were necessary for the company's long-term health. To him, they had been numbers on a page, human resources, to be optimized. He had never thought about the faces, the stories, the lives those numbers represented. The conflict, which had seemed external, now became deeply internal. He was no longer just the innocent victim. He was, in the eyes of Marcus and hundreds of other families, the architect of their ruin. The spontaneous generosity he practiced, giving money and food to children like Leah, now seemed like a form of hypocrisy, a pathetic attempt to soothe the guilt he hadn't even known he carried. The revelation changed everything. The fight was no longer just about protecting Leah, but about confronting the consequences of his own past. As he processed this devastating truth, his phone rang. It was the social worker from the foster home. Her voice choked with panic. "Mr. Sterling, she's gone. Leah, she's not in her room. The window's open. She's gone." The floor seemed to disappear from under Arthur's feet. The hunt in the park wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. They didn't want her to terrorize him. They wanted her as bait. A few minutes later, a text message arrived on his phone from an unknown number. There were no words, just an address. An abandoned warehouse in the industrial district. The same district where the defunct manufacturing plant still bore the Sterling name in rusted letters. And below the address, a final warning. "Come alone, or you'll never see her again." The abandoned warehouse was a skeleton of metal and concrete, a ghostly monument to the kind of industrial progress Arthur represented. The broken windows looked like vacant eyes, watching the decay that time and neglect had wrought. It was here, in this graveyard of lost jobs, that Marcus had chosen for the final confrontation. The air inside the warehouse was heavy with the smell of rust, old oil, and despair. The only light came from industrial lamps hanging from the high ceiling, creating pools of yellow light amidst vast areas of darkness. In the center of one of these pools of light, Leah sat on a wooden chair, small and fragile in the middle of the immense space. She wasn't tied up, but the 5 bikers who formed a circle around her were a more effective prison than any rope. Arthur walked in alone, as instructed, his hands raised to show he was unarmed. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the tense silence. Marcus stood beside Leah, his helmet on a nearby table, his face exposed and impassive. His eyes, however, burned with an intensity that seemed to consume all the oxygen in the room. "Welcome home, Sterling," Marcus said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Recognize the place. This is where my father worked for 30 years. This is where I started, believing in the legacy, in the future. This is where you, with a signature on a piece of paper, destroyed all of it." Arthur didn't answer. He looked at Leah. Her eyes were fixed on him, a mixture of terror and a silent plea. She wasn't crying. It was as if the fear was so great it had dried up all her tears. He had to stay calm. "For her, let her go, Marcus," Arthur said, his voice steady despite the heart hammering in his chest. "Your fight is with me. It always has been." "She's part of the fight now," Marcus replied, placing a hand gently on Leah's shoulder, a gesture that was both protective and menacing. "She's our dividend, the return on your investment in misery." The media, which once painted him as an eccentric philanthropist, now portrayed him as a villain. The police investigation, fueled by anonymous leaks, focused on his fixation with the girl, painting a distorted and sinister picture. His life, once an exemplar of success, had become a public scandal. His partners pressured him, his friends pulled away. He was isolated, cornered by the narrative his enemies had created. His own assets and financial holdings were temporarily frozen by the investigation, a supreme irony. The man who could move fortunes now struggled to access his own money. The fourth obstacle was his own ruined reputation, which rendered him powerless in the eyes of the law and the public. Leah, who had overheard snippets of the men's conversations, was beginning to understand pieces of the puzzle. She heard the name Sterling, the same name on the rusty sign outside. She heard about layoffs, about families with no food. Her angel, the good man who brought her bread, was also the man who had somehow caused these people's pain. Confusion settled in her heart. How could someone be good and bad at the same time? She looked at Marcus, then at Arthur. They were 2 worlds colliding, and she was trapped in the middle. "All you have to do, Sterling, is admit it," Marcus continued, circling Arthur like a wolf. "Admit it in front of her. Tell her that your wealth was built on our ruin. Tell her that every brick in your mansion is cemented with the tears of our families. Tell the truth, and maybe we'll let her go." It was a psychological trap. He didn't want money. He wanted Arthur's complete humiliation, the destruction of his image, even in the eyes of a child. He wanted to break his spirit before he broke his body. Arthur looked at Leah, at those big, frightened eyes that still held a glimmer of faith in him. He took a deep breath. He had a choice: protect his pride or her life. The choice wasn't difficult. "He's right, Leah." Arthur's voice came out low, but clear in the warehouse's silence. Every word was like swallowing broken glass, but he didn't hesitate. He kept his gaze locked on hers, sending a message he hoped she would somehow understand. A long time ago, to keep this company running, to ensure profits and what I thought was success, I made decisions that hurt a lot of people. Good, hardworking people. His family was one of them. Marcus's jaw tightened. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. He wanted anger, denial, arrogance. What he was getting was a calm, direct confession. The other bikers glanced at each other, confusion beginning to chip away at the edge of their rage. They had expected a corporate monster, not a man taking the blame. Leah blinked, processing the words. The revelation didn't make her hate Arthur. In her simple world, people made mistakes. What mattered was what came next. And in her eyes, Arthur wasn't shrinking. On the contrary, By admitting his failure, he seemed bigger, more human. "But that doesn't change what you did for me." Her small voice cut through the tension, surprising everyone, including herself. "You were good to me. You gave me food. You saved me." She turned in her chair, facing Marcus. "He made a mistake, but what you're doing now is wrong, too." The silence that followed was profound. The simple truth from the mouth of a child carried a weight that no complex argument could. She had disarmed the situation with the pure, innocent logic of decency. Marcus's conviction wavered for an instant. The script he had rehearsed in his mind for years was unraveling. He had expected a one-dimensional villain, but the reality was far more complicated. It was then that the most devastating revelation came to light. Not from Arthur or Marcus, but from one of the other bikers, an older man who had remained silent until now. "Enough, Marcus," he said, his voice tired. "Tell him the truth, the whole truth." Marcus shot him a furious look. "Shut up, Ricardo." But it was too late. Ricardo stepped forward, removing his helmet to reveal a face etched with sadness. "This girl," he said, looking at Arthur, "we didn't find her by accident. She wasn't under that bridge by coincidence." Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you talking about?" "She's Marcus's niece," Ricardo revealed, "and the bomb exploded in the middle of the warehouse. His younger brother's daughter, Claudio. Claudio worked here too. When he got laid off, he couldn't handle it. He just gave up. Left his family. The girl ended up on the streets. Marcus has been looking for her for months. He found her under that bridge, taking handouts from the man he blamed for everything. It was fate, he said, the perfect chance for revenge." Arthur's world tilted on its axis. Leah, Marcus's niece. The complexity of the situation was crushing. The girl he was trying to save was the missing link in the family he had inadvertently helped destroy. Marcus hadn't kidnapped her. In a way, he was rescuing her, using her as a pawn in his sick game of revenge. Leah looked at Marcus, her eyes wide. "Uncle?" The word came out as an incredulous whisper. She had vague memories of him, of a man who used to visit when she was very little, before everything fell apart. Marcus couldn't meet her gaze. Shame was a dark cloak over him. His plan for revenge, which had seemed so righteous in his mind, now felt monstrous and selfish. He had used his own family's pain, his own niece's suffering, as a weapon. Arthur, in turn, saw the truth in its full, cruel totality. The connection between them wasn't chance, but a web of consequences, woven by a single business decision years ago. He looked at the broken man before him and the confused child at the center of it all, and he realized the only way out wasn't through force or money, but through something he had long forgotten: empathy. The air in the warehouse grew thin, dense with the truth that had just been spoken. Arthur looked from Marcus to Leah, and the web of connections lit up in his mind with painful clarity. Every act of kindness toward her had been, without his knowledge, a direct insult to the man who hated him. Every piece of bread was a reminder of Marcus's family's empty table. He wasn't a rescuing angel, he was salt in a man's wound. The realization emptied him of all anger, all fear for himself, leaving only an abyss of remorse and a cold determination. Marcus's revenge was no longer about money or status. It was about lineage, about blood, about the pain of a broken family. And Leah was the beating heart of that pain. Marcus, exposed and vulnerable, saw the contempt in his own men's eyes, the confusion on his niece's face, the armor of his righteous anger shattered, revealing the desperate man beneath. Arthur took a step forward, into the circle of light, onto the stage of this family drama. He didn't look at Marcus, but at the other men. "What happened to your families was my responsibility," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I hid behind spreadsheets and the cold logic of business. I was wrong." Then he turned to Marcus, and his eyes held not fear, but a deep, weary sorrow. You want justice? You want me to pay? You're right. But the price isn't my life. My death will give you nothing. It won't bring your brother back. It won't return the jobs. It won't put food on your tables. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. So I offer you something better. I will trade my old life for her freedom. From this day forward, my time, my assets, my influence, everything will be dedicated to fixing what I broke. We'll create a fund for the families that were laid off. We'll offer new jobs, training. I will help you find your brother. My life, as I knew it, ends today, and a new one begins. Dedicated to paying this debt, that is my offer. Take everything I have, everything I am, but leave her out of this. Let her be a child. Arthur's speech wasn't a plea, it was an abdication, the total surrender of his ego, of his pride. For Marcus, it was as if the floor had been ripped out from under him. He had prepared to fight a corporate giant, an arrogant monster. Instead, he found a man offering penance. A penance so complete and overwhelming that his revenge became petty and meaningless. The rage that had fueled him for years died out, leaving only a cold emptiness. He staggered back, his legs giving way, and leaned against a rusty steel beam, his head bowed, his body shaking with silent sobs. He hadn't won. He had lost himself. It was in this moment of total collapse that Leah showed her courage once more. It was not a courage of fire and iron, but of compassion and grace. She slipped silently from the chair. All eyes turned to her. She did not run to Arthur, her protector. She did not run to the door, her escape. With slow, deliberate steps, she walked across the dusty floor, her small body crossing the chasm that separated the two men. She stopped right in front of Marcus, the man who had kidnapped her, the man who had used her as a weapon. He still had his head bowed, lost in his own shame. Leah waited a moment, and then, in a gesture that broke every heart in the warehouse, she reached out her small, dirty hand, not to ask, but to offer. She gently touched his arm. He raised his head slowly, his eyes red and filled with tears, and met her face, which held no accusation, only a sad, childlike understanding. "Uncle," she whispered, the word a balm on the open wound of his soul. Leah's touch was the final straw that broke the dam of Marcus's remorse. The sob he'd been holding back exploded in a sound of raw pain, a lament for years of wasted anger and lost chances. He fell to his knees before her, not as a gang leader, but as a broken man before the innocence he had almost destroyed. "Forgive me, Leah," he choked out, the words tearing at his throat. "I'm so sorry. I was so blind." Arthur watched the scene, his heart tight with a mixture of relief and a profound sadness for the devastation his actions had caused. This was not the violent climax he had feared, but an emotional implosion, far more powerful and final. The crisis had peaked and now began to recede, leaving behind the wreckage of lives that needed to be rebuilt. Marcus's surrender was the signal for the tension in the warehouse to dissipate. The other bikers let down their guard, their aggressive postures melting into slumped shoulders and expressions of exhaustion. They weren't monsters, they were fathers, husbands, and sons who had been pushed to the edge. Arthur's offer hung in the air, no longer a desperate bargain, but a bridge across the abyss that separated them. The resolution began right there, on that dirty floor. Arthur reaffirmed his promise, not as an act of charity, but as a moral obligation. In the days and weeks that followed, he kept his word with an obsessive determination. He liquidated some of his stock, used his capital to create a rehabilitation fund. He hired consultants to help reopen parts of the old manufacturing plant under a new, cooperative, and inclusive business model. He offered Marcus and his men not handouts, but jobs, dignity, and a path to rebuild their lives. Arthur's first victory was disarming the hatred. Marcus, transformed by Leah's forgiveness and Arthur's sincerity, became his most unlikely ally, using his leadership to convince other skeptical former employees to accept the opportunity. However, this victory came at a cost. The public and the police saw his methods as a form of negotiating with terrorists. He was criticized for rewarding men who had threatened him, a gross oversimplification that ignored the complexity of the situation. He faced hearings, investigations, and the scorn of his peers, but for the first time in his life, the fluctuations of public opinion didn't affect him. He was focused on a different kind of return on investment, a human one. His second and most difficult victory was gaining temporary custody of Leah. The process was a bureaucratic nightmare. The authorities questioned everything: his prior relationship with her, the kidnapping, his new association with Marcus. It was Leah herself, in her testimony to a family court judge, who tipped the scales. With a clarity stunning for her age, she explained that she had two uncles now: her uncle by blood, Marcus, who had been lost but found his way back, and her uncle of the heart, Arthur, who protected her when she had no one. She said she felt safe with both of them. The judge, moved by the girl's wisdom and convinced by Arthur's rehabilitation efforts, granted him temporary custody on the condition that Marcus have unrestricted access to his niece, allowing the family to begin to heal. The narrative arcs resolved gradually. Marcus, working side by side with Arthur, rediscovered his purpose and began the arduous task of reconnecting with Leah, learning to be the uncle she needed. The other men from the gang found stability and a new self-respect. The community, slowly, began to see the fruits of Arthur's new investment, not just in terms of money, but in renewed hope. For Arthur, the transformation was total. He sold his secluded mansion and moved into a comfortable but not ostentatious house. He stepped back from the daily management of his more aggressive businesses, focusing his energy on social impact projects. He discovered that true profit wasn't in quarterly dividends, but in Leah's smile when she came home from school, in the silent gratitude in the eyes of a man who got his job back, in the feeling of building something lasting and meaningful. The main conflict, the struggle between his generosity and his naivete, was resolved. He learned that helping wasn't just about giving, but about understanding, connecting, and taking responsibility for the consequences of his actions, past and present. 3 weeks had passed since the dark night under the bridge. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the living room window, painting golden stripes on the soft rug where Leah lay on her stomach, absorbed in her drawing. The sound that filled the house wasn't the roar of traffic, but the gentle scratch of colored pencils on paper and the ticking of a wall clock. Arthur watched her from his armchair, a book forgotten in his lap. He had spent decades accumulating a fortune, measuring his success in stock charts, in the rising value of his assets and the expansion of his businesses. Now, he understood his true net worth was right there, in that room, in the safety of that girl. The peace he felt was a return on investment that no treasury bond or cryptocurrency could ever provide. The official adoption had been finalized the week before, a quiet and deeply personal victory that surpassed any corporate acquisition he had ever celebrated. Leah got up and walked over to him, holding out a sheet of paper. "Look, Uncle Arthur." In the drawing, 3 clumsy stick figures held hands on a colorful bridge. Above them, a smiling yellow sun. She pointed to each figure. "This is me, this is you, and this is Uncle Marcus." Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. In that simple drawing was the entire story. The bridge that was nearly an end had become a point of connection. Marcus, now the manager of the newly formed cooperative at the old manufacturing plant, visited Leah every weekend. The healing between them was slow, fragile, but real. Built on the foundation of forgiveness the girl herself had taught them. The man, who was almost thrown from a bridge for symbolizing social inequality, had become an example of how privilege can be used to build bridges instead of chasms. He was no longer just a multi-billionaire. He was an architect of second chances. His life had changed irrevocably. He learned that true wealth wasn't in having money, but in the courage to use one's resources fairly and compassionately. The meetings about cash flow and dividends were replaced by community gatherings, planning training programs and support systems. He found a far deeper joy in funding a child's education than in celebrating a bull market. The journey had been terrifying, but the destination was more rewarding than any inheritance he could have imagined. The child who lived under the bridge, who knew only the hardness of concrete, discovered that her bravery could move mountains and change lives, including her own. She was learning to read, to dream, and most importantly, to trust again. She had taught a wealthy man that the greatest lessons in humanity sometimes come from the smallest hearts. Armed only with rusty iron pipes and an infinite courage no fortune can buy. He looked at the drawing, at the three figures united, and knew that he was finally home.